The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the Galactic Military Academy. Jake Martinez stood with his fellow cadets in the massive biodome, watching as artificial clouds drifted overhead. The dome stretched for miles in every direction, filled with forests, rivers, and mountains that looked completely real. Everything here was designed to test cadets from dozens of different worlds. Commander Vexthari stepped forward, her crystalline body catching the light. Like a living diamond? She stood nearly 8 feet tall, with sharp angles that seemed to cut through the air itself. When she spoke, her voice rang like bells made of ice. "Today you will face the survival challenge," she announced. "Each of you must build a shelter using only what you find in the forest. No technology, no manufactured materials, no weapons except basic tools." Jake looked around at his classmates. They came from all over the galaxy, each species bringing their own special abilities. Next to him stood Creolon, whose 6 arms moved constantly as he calculated angles and measurements in his head. The insectoid's compound eyes could see things no human eye could detect. His people built cities that looked like massive works of art, all curves and flowing lines that seemed to grow from the ground itself. On Jake's other side, their mouth shifted nervously. The amphibian's blue-green skin glistened with moisture, and his large eyes blinked slowly. His people lived underwater, building cities from coral and sea plants. On land, he needed to keep his skin wet or he would become uncomfortable quickly. Behind them, Zixara swayed gently in the artificial breeze. The plant-like being looked like a walking tree with bark-like skin and leaves that moved even when there was no wind. Her people could talk to plants, making them grow into any shape they wanted. They had cities that were still alive, still growing, still changing every day. "You have exactly 48 hours, Commander Vexthari continued. "At the end of that time, we will activate the weather systems. The storm will test your shelters. If your shelter fails, you fail the exercise." The other cadets began pulling out their scanning devices. Creolon's 6 arms moved like a blur as he set up 3 different analyzers. Dermouth activated a moisture detector and a structural integrity scanner. Zixara extended thin tendrils from her fingers, testing the air for chemical signals that might tell her about the local plant life. Jake just walked to the edge of the forest and stopped. He put his hand on the bark of a large tree and closed his eyes. The bark felt rough under his palm, with deep grooves that ran up and down the trunk. He could feel the tree's strength, the way it had grown over many years to become thick and sturdy. "Martinez," called Creolon, "are you not going to scan the materials? How will you know their molecular composition?" Jake opened his eyes and smiled. "I can feel it," he said simply. The insectoid's compound eyes focused on Jake with confusion. "Feel it? Your species has no natural sensors for molecular analysis. How can you determine structural integrity through touch alone?" "My people have been building things for thousands of years," Jake explained. "We learn to understand materials by working with them, not by scanning them." Dermouth's large eyes blinked slowly. "But surely you need data. Compression ratios, flexibility indexes, weather resistance ratings. How do you calculate load-bearing capacity?" Jake picked up a fallen branch and bent it slightly. It flexed without breaking, then returned to its original shape. "This one's good," he said. "It's flexible but strong. See how it bends but doesn't crack?" The amphibian stared at the branch as if it were some kind of alien artifact. "You determined its structural properties by dunding it?" "Sometimes the simple ways work best," Jake said. Zixara's leaves rustled with what might have been laughter. "Your species is fascinating, Jake Martinez. You use methods that our computers would consider primitive, yet you seem confident in your results." "My grandmother taught me to build with my hands," Jake said. "She said machines can tell you what something is made of, but only your hands can tell you how it wants to be used." The plant being tilted her head, which looked like a cluster of branches with leaves. "How it wants to be used. Materials do not have preferences." Jake knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt. He rubbed it between his fingers, feeling its texture. Then he added a few drops of water from his canteen and worked it into mud. "This clay wants to be shaped," he said. It's smooth and sticky. It wants to hold things together. But this sandy soil over here, he picked up a different handful of dirt. This wants to drain water. It doesn't want to be shaped. It wants to be a foundation. The alien cadets watched in fascination as Jake continued his simple tests. He smelled different types of wood, explaining that some smells meant the wood was rotting and weak, while others meant it was strong and healthy. He showed them how to test if a branch was dead or alive by looking at its color and flexibility. Your methods are so ... direct, Creolon said. My people would spend hours analyzing the molecular structure of each material before beginning construction. And we would create detailed chemical profiles of every substance, added Dermouth. How can you be certain of your results without scientific verification? Jake stood up and wiped the dirt from his hands. Because my people have been using these methods for thousands of years. We built cities and bridges and ships long before we had machines to help us. We learned to trust our senses because our senses learned to understand the world around us. Commander Vexthari had been listening to the conversation from a distance. Her crystalline form reflected the light in complex patterns as she moved closer. Interesting approach, Cadet Martinez. Your species continues to surprise us with methods that seem primitive yet produce effective results. It's not primitive, Jake said quietly. It's just different. The commander's diamond-like face showed what might have been approval. We shall see. You have 46 hours remaining. I suggest you all begin construction. The alien cadets scattered into the forest, their scanning devices beeping and humming as they analyzed every tree, rock, and plant they encountered. Jake watched them for a moment, then walked deeper into the woods. He found a small clearing near a stream. The ground was level, with good drainage, and there were plenty of trees nearby. He sat down cross-legged and just looked around for several minutes. He wasn't scanning or analyzing. He was feeling the space, understanding how the wind moved. Through the trees, where the morning sun would shine, where the rain would flow, after a while he began to gather materials. He chose young branches that were flexible but strong, testing each one with his hands. He collected different types of leaves, examining their thickness and texture. He found clay-rich soil near the stream and tested it by making small balls that held their shape when dried. As the day wore on, the sounds of construction filled the forest. Jake could hear Creolon's 6 arms working rapidly, building something that involved a lot of precise measurements and calculations. Dermouth was near the stream, trying to adapt his underwater building techniques to work on land. Zixara was attempting to communicate with the local plants. Though her frustrated rustling suggested the earth, plants weren't responding the way she expected. Jake worked quietly and steadily. He didn't rush or worry about time. He had learned from his grandmother that good building came from understanding, not from speed. Each material had to be chosen carefully. Each piece had to fit properly with all the others. By evening, the other cadets had impressive piles of analyzed materials and detailed holographic blueprints, showing their planned structures. Jake had a much smaller pile of carefully selected branches, leaves, and clay. But he had also laid the foundation for his shelter using nothing but stones and packed earth. As the artificial sun began to set, Jake sat by his small fire and ate his evening ration. Tomorrow would bring the real test. He could hear his fellow cadets still working, their devices humming and beeping in the darkness. Their advanced technology would continue working all night, analyzing and calculating. Jake looked at his simple foundation and smiled. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Tomorrow he would show them what human hands could build. The second day began with the sound of breaking branches echoing through the forest. Jake looked up from his work to see Creolon standing amid the wreckage of what had been a beautiful curved structure. The insectoid's 6 arms moved frantically as he tried to understand what had gone wrong. The adhesive compounds are not responding correctly, Creolon muttered, his compound eyes scanning the broken pieces. The molecular bonding should have been perfect. My calculations were precise. Jake walked over to examine the fallen structure. The pieces looked like they had been glued together with something that dried hard and brittle. When the wind had Blown against the curved walls, they had snapped apart at the joints. "What kind of glue did you use?" Jake asked. Creolon's mandibles clicked together in frustration. "It is not glue. It is a natural secretion that my people produce for construction. On the hive worlds, it creates bonds stronger than metal. But here ... He gestured at the broken pieces. "Here it becomes weak and breaks easily." "Maybe the problem is not the glue," Jake suggested. "Maybe the problem is how you are using it." "Impossible," Creolon said quickly. "My people have built cities using these methods for thousands of years. The technique is proven." Jake picked up one of the broken pieces and examined it closely. The wood was split along its grain, showing that the adhesive had indeed held strongly. "Too strongly. Your glue worked fine," he said. "But wood is not like the materials on your world. Wood wants to move and bend. When you glue it rigid, it fights back." Creolon's 6 arms stopped moving. "Materials do not fight back. They follow the laws of physics." "Everything follows the laws of physics," Jake agreed. "But every material has its own personality, what likes to flex. If you force it to be rigid, it will break." The insectoid stared at Jake with his compound eyes. "Personality? You speak of inanimate materials as if they were alive?" "In a way they are," Jake said. "This wood came from a living tree. It grew for years, bending with the wind, stretching toward the sun. Even after it is cut, it remembers how to move." Nearby, Dermouth was having his own problems. The amphibian had tried to weave walls from the plants growing near the stream, but without water to support them, the woven materials had dried out and become brittle. His first wall had cracked and fallen apart during the night. "This is impossible," Dermouth said, his large eyes blinking slowly. "These plants do not behave like the sea vegetation on my world. They become rigid when they dry, and they crack under pressure." Jake walked over to look at the amphibian's work. The weaving was beautiful and complex, with patterns that reminded him of underwater coral formations. But the plants Dermouth had chosen were thin and delicate, designed to float in water, not to bear weight on land. "You are a good weaver," Jake said. "But maybe you need different plants." "All plants are essentially the same," Dermouth replied. "They follow the same biological principles." Jake shook his head. "Land plants are different from water plants. They have to be stronger to hold themselves up without water to support them. Look." He pointed to a thick, fibrous plant growing nearby. "This one has tough fibers because it has to stand up to wind and weather. Your sea plants only had to deal with water currents." The amphibian's skin glistened as he considered this. "You mean I should choose materials based on their environment, not just their chemical composition?" "Exactly," Jake said. "Everything is shaped by where it lives and how it grows." Zixara was perhaps the most frustrated of all. As a plant-like being, she had expected to work easily with the earth vegetation. But the local plants did not respond to her chemical signals the way plants on her world did. She had been trying all morning to convince a cluster of young trees to grow into the shape she wanted, but they ignored her completely. "They will not listen," she said, her leaves rustling with irritation. "I send the proper growth hormones, the correct chemical messages, but they do not respond. It is as if they speak a completely different language." Jake approached the plant being carefully. "Maybe they do speak a different language. These plants evolved on Earth, not on your world. They might use different signals." Zixaris branch-like head turned toward him. "But the principles of plant communication are universal. Growth hormones, chemical signals, root networks. All plants use these methods." "The methods might be the same, but the details are different," Jake explained. "Like how all people can talk, but they use different words in different languages." The plant being's leaves droop slightly. "So I cannot communicate with them at all?" "Maybe not the way you are used to," Jake said. "But there might be other ways to work with them." He showed her how to examine the natural growth patterns of the trees, how to see which way they wanted to bend, which branches were strongest. Instead of trying to force them to change, he suggested working with their natural shapes. "You mean I should adapt my design to fit the plants, rather than forcing the plants to fit my design?" Zixara asked. That is how my people learn to build, Jake said. We work with what nature gives us, not against it. As the day progressed, Jake watched his fellow cadets struggle with the same basic problem. They were all trying to force the Earth materials to behave like the materials from their home worlds. When that did not work, they became frustrated and made the same mistakes over and over. Creolon built 3 more structures, each one using more adhesive than the last. Each one became more rigid and brittle, and each one broke more spectacularly than the one before. His precise calculations meant nothing when the materials refused to follow his assumptions. Their mouth tried different weaving patterns, making them tighter and more complex. But the tighter he wove the plants, the more stress he put on the individual fibers. His walls kept falling apart, and he could not understand why his skill at underwater construction was useless on land. Zixara attempted to use her own growth abilities to create living supports for her shelter. She extended root-like tendrils into the ground and tried to create a framework from her own body. But without the support of other plants, and without the familiar soil chemistry of her homeworld, her efforts left her weakened and still without a viable shelter. Jake continued his own work steadily. He had begun weaving flexible branches together, not with rigid joints like Creolon, but with loose connections that allowed each piece to move independently. He tested each joint by hand, feeling how much stress it could take before it began to fail. Why do you work so slowly? Darmouth asked during the afternoon. You could build much faster if you used proper tools and measurements. Jake looked up from his careful weaving. I work at the speed the materials want to be worked. If I rush, I make mistakes. If I make mistakes, I have to start over. That takes longer than doing it right the first time. But how do you know what speed the materials want? Creolon asked. Materials do not have preferences. They do if you learn to listen, Jake said. Wood tells you when it is being stressed too much. It makes little creaking sounds. Clay tells you when it is too dry or too wet by how it feels in your hands. You just have to pay attention. The alien cadets watched in amazement as Jake continued. His work? He would pick up a branch, test its flexibility, and then either use it or set it aside. He would mix small amounts of clay and water, testing the consistency until it felt right. He would examine leaves for thickness and flexibility, choosing only the ones that met his needs. Your methods are so inefficient, Zixara observed. You test each piece individually instead of analyzing the materials in bulk. Each piece is different, Jake explained. Even branches from the same tree have different strengths and weaknesses. I need to understand each one before I can use it properly. By evening, the alien cadets had impressive piles of materials and detailed plans, but no working shelters. Their advanced knowledge and sophisticated analytical abilities had failed them completely. The materials of Earth refused to behave according to their homeworld expectations. Jake, meanwhile, had constructed a framework of woven branches that swayed gently in the breeze, but showed no signs of breaking. He had begun applying a mixture of clay and plant fibers to create walls that were rough and organic-looking, but surprisingly strong. As the artificial sun set on the second day, Jake sat by his fire and looked at his half-finished shelter. Tomorrow would bring the storm, and he still had work to do. But he was not worried. The shelter was growing naturally from the materials at hand, each piece working with all the others. In the distance, he could hear his fellow cadets still working, their frustration growing with each failed attempt. Their advanced civilizations had given them powerful tools and vast knowledge, but they had forgotten the most important lesson of all. Sometimes you have to listen to what the world is trying to tell you. The third day began with desperation. Jake could hear his fellow cadets talking in urgent voices as they tried to salvage their failed projects. The storm was coming in less than 12 hours, and none of them had a working shelter. We must combine our efforts, Creolon announced, his 6 arms gesturing wildly. Separately we have failed. Together we might succeed. Darmouth nodded quickly, water dripping from his blue-green skin. Yes, my weaving skills with your structural knowledge and Zixara's plant expertise. We can create something that uses All our strengths, Zixara's leaves rustled in agreement. It is our only hope. We have wasted too much time trying to work alone. Jake looked up from his own work. His shelter was nearly complete now, and it looked nothing like anything the aliens had attempted. The walls curved naturally, following the shape of the ground. The roof was low and rounded, designed to shed wind and rain. Everything about it seemed to grow from the earth itself. Jake Martinez, Creolon called out. Would you like to join our combined effort? Your unusual methods might be helpful. Jake smiled and shook his head. Thank you, but I think I will finish my own shelter. You are welcome to watch and learn. If you want. The insectoid's compound eyes focused on Jake's structure with new interest. How did you know to make the walls curve like that? What calculations did you use? No calculations, Jake said, smoothing mud between his fingers. I just thought about how the wind would hit the walls. A curved wall lets the wind slide around it instead of pushing against it. But without mathematical analysis, how can you be certain of the optimal curve? Darmouth asked, his large eyes blinking slowly. Jake stood up and walked to a nearby tree. He pointed to how the trunk was thicker at the base and tapered toward the top. This tree has been dealing with wind. For 50 years, it knows the right shape. I just copied what nature already figured out. The three alien cadets stared at the tree as if seeing it for the first time. Zixara's leaves trembled slightly. You learned engineering from observing natural growth patterns? My grandmother always said that nature is the best teacher, Jake replied. Everything in nature has to deal with the same forces we do. Wind, rain, gravity, temperature changes. If you watch how living things handle these problems, you can learn a lot. Creolon's mandibles clicked together thoughtfully. But surely there are better methods than simple observation. My people have computer models that can simulate millions of design variations. Maybe, Jake said. But this tree did not need a computer. It just grew stronger wherever it needed to be stronger. It changed shape wherever it needed to change shape. After 50 years, it found the perfect design. He walked back to his shelter and picked up a handful of the mud mixture he had been using. This clay comes from the bottom of the stream. It has been ground up by water and rocks for thousands of years. It knows how to stick to things. I just add plant fibers to make it stronger and tree sap to make it waterproof. You tested the waterproofing capabilities of tree sap? Darmouth asked. I watched what happens to trees in the rain, Jake said simply. Water rolls right off their bark. So I used bark and sap in my walls. The amphibian's skin glistened as he considered this. You are saying that you reverse-engineered natural waterproofing systems through observation alone? I'm saying I paid attention to what works, Jake corrected. Everything I need to know is right here in the forest. I just have to look at it the right way. Zixara moved closer to examine Jake's walls. The plant fibers you added to the clay. How did you know which ones to use? Jake pulled a fiber from his mixture and held it up. I tested different plants to see which ones were strongest. Some break easily, others stretch without breaking. Others are good at holding water. I mixed different kinds together to get what I needed. You created a composite material, the plant being said with wonder. Without any chemical analysis, you determined the optimal combination of organic fibers for structural reinforcement. I just tried different things until I found what worked. Jake said. The alien cadets watched in fascination as Jake continued his work. He applied the mud mixture to his walls with his bare hands, smoothing it into place with movements that looked more like sculpture than construction. The walls were not perfectly smooth or evenly thick, but they looked incredibly strong. Your construction methods are so intuitive, Creolon observed. You seem to know instinctively how thick to make each section, where to add reinforcement, how to join different materials. Jake paused in his work. My people have been building things for a very long time. We pass down knowledge from parents to children for thousands of years. Each generation learned from the mistakes of the one before. After all that time, we developed a feel for what works. But without scientific instruments, how can you be certain your methods are optimal? Darmouth asked. Because they work, Jake said simply. My ancestors built houses that stood for hundreds of years. They built bridges that carried heavy loads. They built ships that sailed across oceans. If the methods did not work, my people would not have survived. He showed them how he had chosen the branches for his frame. Each one was slightly different, but all of them were flexible enough to bend without breaking. I did not want the strongest branches, he explained. I wanted the ones that could move with the wind and rain. A tree that cannot bend will break in a storm. Flexibility over strength, Zixara murmured. Your design philosophy prioritizes adaptability. Everything changes, Jake said. The weather changes. The ground shifts. Materials expand and contract. A good building has to be able to change with everything else. He demonstrated how his walls were designed to breathe. The mud mixture was porous enough to let air through, but thick enough to keep out rain. The plant fibers created a network that could stretch and compress without cracking. You have created a living building, Dermouth said in amazement. It responds to environmental changes like a biological organism. All good buildings are alive in their own way, Jake replied. They have to be. Dead things break. Living things adapt. The alien cadets abandoned their own projects and gathered around Jake's shelter. They watched as he added the final touches to his roof, weaving leaves and branches together in patterns that looked random but were actually carefully planned. How do you know where to place each piece? Creolon asked. I think about the rain. Jake said, where will it hit first? Where will it try to get in? I make sure those places are extra strong and extra waterproof. He showed them how he had designed channels to carry water away from the shelter. The roof was shaped to guide rainwater toward specific points where it would drip harmlessly onto the ground. The walls were angled to shed water rather than absorb. Your approach integrates multiple engineering disciplines, Zixara observed. Structural engineering, materials science, fluid dynamics, environmental adaptation. Yet you claim to use no formal analysis. I use the analysis that my people developed over thousands of years, Jake said. We learn by trying things and seeing what happened. We learned by watching nature. We learned by making mistakes and fixing them. As the day wore on, the alien cadets tried to apply some of Jake's methods to their own construction, but they struggled with the concept of working without precise measurements and calculations. They had been trained to analyze everything before. Acting in Jake's intuitive approach felt dangerous to them. How do you know when you have added enough fiber to the clay? Dermouth asked, trying to mix his own mud. You feel it, Jake said. When it feels right in your hands, it is right. The amphibian's large eyes blinked in confusion. But what does right feel like? Jake thought for a moment. Like bread dough when it is ready to bake. Like wet sand when it is perfect for building castles, you will know when you feel it. By evening, Jake's shelter was complete. It looked like it had grown. From the forest floor, natural and organic. The alien cadets had managed to build a combined structure that was more stable than their individual efforts. But it still looked artificial and rigid compared to Jake's creation. As the sun set, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. The storm was coming, and soon they would all discover whose approach to building would survive the test of nature's fury. The first drops of rain began to fall just as the alien cadets put the finishing touches on their combined shelter. The structure looked impressive from the outside, with precise angles and carefully calculated joints. Creolon had used his strongest adhesives. Dermouth had woven the walls in complex patterns, and Zixara had managed to convince some local vines to help hold everything together. We should take shelter now, Creolon announced, his compound eyes scanning the darkening sky. The storm protocols will activate soon. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind began to pick up. Jake looked at his own shelter one last time, checking the mud walls and the woven roof. Everything felt solid and ready. The structure seemed to settle deeper into the ground as the first strong wind hit it. Jake Martinez, Dermouth called out. Your shelter is very small. There might be room for you in ours if you need it? Jake smiled and waved. Thank you, but I think mine will be fine. Good luck! The alien cadets disappeared into their shelter just as the rain began to fall harder. Jake ducked into his own small structure and settled down to wait. Inside, the space felt warm and cozy. The curved walls seemed to wrap around him like protective arms. Outside, the storm grew stronger by the minute. The weather control systems had created something that felt completely real. Wind howled through the trees, bending them almost to the breaking point. Rain pounded down so hard that it sounded like stones hitting the ground. Jake's shelter responded to the storm like a living thing. The flexible frame swayed gently with the wind instead of fighting against it. The curved walls let the air flow smoothly around them. The roof channeled water away from the structure, sending streams of rain flowing harmlessly past the entrance inside. Jake could hear the storm, but he stayed completely dry. The mud walls absorbed some of the sound, making the howling wind seem distant and less threatening. The plant fibers in the walls flexed slightly with each gust, but nothing cracked or broke. From across the clearing came a loud snapping sound, followed by shouting voices. Jake peered out through his doorway and saw that part of the alien shelter had collapsed. One wall had broken away from the frame and was flapping in the wind like a giant leaf. "The adhesive bonds are failing," he heard Krelon shout over the storm. "The wind stress exceeds our calculations." "The weave is coming apart," Dermouth called back. "The materials are too rigid, they cannot flex with the wind." Jake watched as more pieces of their shelter broke away. The problem was exactly what he had expected. The alien cadets had built their structure to be strong, but they had made it too rigid. When the wind hit it, the shelter could not bend, so it broke instead. Another loud crack echoed through the storm, and Jake saw the alien cadets running from their collapsing shelter. They were getting soaked in the rain, and they had nowhere else to go. The storm was too strong for them to survive in the open. Without thinking, Jake ran out into the storm. The rain hit him like cold needles, and the wind nearly knocked him down. But he fought his way to where his fellow cadets were huddled together. "This way!" he shouted over the howling wind. "Come to my shelter." "It is too small," Krelon protested, water streaming off his insectoid body. "4 beings cannot fit in such a tiny space. Trust me," Jake said. "Come on." He led them back to his shelter, which was still standing solid and unchanged despite the raging storm. The entrance looked impossibly small for all of them, but Jake gestured for them to go inside. One by one, the alien cadets crawled into the shelter. Krelon had to fold his 6 arms carefully to fit through the doorway. Dermouth's amphibian body slid in easily. Zixara had to compress her branch-like limbs, but she managed to squeeze inside. To everyone's amazement, they all fit comfortably. The interior was larger than it had looked from outside, and the curved walls seemed to expand to accommodate them all. More importantly, they were completely dry and protected from the storm. "This is impossible," Dermouth said, his large eyes blinking in wonder. "The internal volume appears greater than the external dimensions would suggest. It is just shaped right," Jake said. "My grandmother taught me that round rooms feel bigger than square ones, and low ceilings make you feel safer in a storm." The alien cadets sat in amazement as the storm raged outside. Inside Jake's shelter, they could barely hear the wind. The rain drummed on the roof above them, but not a single drop came through. The walls seemed to breathe slightly with each gust of wind, but everything held together perfectly. "How is this structure maintaining integrity under these conditions?" Krelon asked. "Our calculations showed that winds of this velocity would destroy any organic construction." "Because it bends instead of breaking?" Jake explained. "See how the walls move a little? That means they are absorbing the wind's energy instead of fighting against it." Zixara's leaves rustled softly in the dim light filtering through the woven roof. "Your shelter is not just protecting us from the storm. It feels alive, like we are inside a living creature that is keeping us safe." "In a way, we are," Jake said. "Everything here came from living things. The wood remembers how to bend with the wind. The clay remembers how to hold water. The plant fibers remember how to stretch without breaking. A particularly strong gust of wind shook the entire forest outside, but inside the shelter they felt only a gentle swaying motion. It was almost comforting, like being rocked to sleep. "I do not understand," Dermouth said. "Our shelter used similar materials, but it could not withstand even moderate wind stress." "You tried to make the materials do what you wanted them to do," Jake explained. "I let them do what they wanted to do, and then I used that to build something strong." He pointed to how the roof was constructed. The branches were not forced into rigid positions. Instead, they were woven together in a way that let each piece move independently while still supporting the whole structure. "Each branch can bend without affecting the others," he said. "When the wind pushes on one side, that side gives way a little, but the other side stays strong. The whole roof acts like a living thing that can adapt to whatever the storm throws at it." Creel on S6. Arms moved slowly as he examined the construction around him. "You have created a structure that exhibits emergent properties. The whole system is more resilient than any individual component. My people call it working together," Jake said simply. "Each piece does its job, but they all help each other." 2. As the storm continued to rage outside, the alien cadets began to understand something they had never experienced before. Jake's shelter did not just protect them from the weather. It made them feel safe and comfortable, even in the middle of a violent storm. The walls seemed to absorb not just the sound of the wind, but also their fear and anxiety. The curved space felt protective and nurturing, like being held by caring hands. The organic materials created a connection to the natural world outside, even while keeping them safe from its fury. "This is remarkable," Zixara said softly. "I have lived my entire life surrounded by living architecture, but I have never experienced anything like this. Your shelter does not just provide protection, it provides comfort. Buildings should take care of the people inside them," Jake said. "That is what my grandmother always said. A house is not just walls and a roof. It is a place where people can feel safe and happy." Hours passed as the storm continued outside. The alien cadets talked quietly among themselves, marveling at how different they felt inside Jake's shelter compared to their own failed construction. They began to understand that human building methods were not primitive at all. They were sophisticated in ways that advanced technology could not match. When the storm finally began to weaken, and the first hints of dawn appeared through the woven roof, the 4 cadets emerged from the shelter to find a transformed landscape. Trees had fallen, streams had changed course, and debris was scattered everywhere, but Jake's small shelter stood exactly as it had before the storm, looking like it had grown from the earth itself. It had not just survived the test. It had thrived. The morning sun cast long shadows across the storm-damaged forest as Commander Vextari arrived for the final evaluation. Her crystalline form reflected the light in sharp patterns as she surveyed the aftermath of the night's weather test. Broken branches lay scattered across the ground, and small streams had carved new paths through the clearing. The alien cadets stood beside the remains of their collapsed shelter, looking tired and somewhat embarrassed. Pieces of their carefully calculated structure were scattered across a wide area, some hanging from nearby trees where the wind had carried them. Jake's shelter sat in the same spot where he had built it, looking as if it had been there for years, rather than days. Leaves and small branches had settled against its curved walls, making it blend even more naturally with the forest around it. "Interesting," Commander Vextari said, her voice ringing like crystal bells. "I see we have one successful shelter and one failure. Would someone care to explain what happened?" Creelon stepped forward, his 6 arms moving nervously. "Commander, our design was mathematically perfect. We used the strongest available adhesives and the most efficient structural patterns. By all calculations, it should have withstood the storm conditions, yet it did not," the commander observed. "Why do you think that happened?" "The materials did not behave according to our models," Dormouth said, water still glistening on his blue-green skin. "The organic compounds of this world have different properties than those we are familiar with. Commander Vextharius' diamond-like face turned toward Jake. And you, Cadet Martinez? How did your shelter survive when theirs did not? Jake looked at his fellow cadets before answering. I think the difference was not in the materials, Commander. It was in how we used them. Explain. My friends tried to make the Earth materials behave like materials from their homeworlds, Jake said carefully. When that did not work, they thought the materials were wrong. But the materials were not wrong. They were just different. Zixara's leaves rustled softly. Jake Martinez taught us something important during the storm, Commander. His methods are not primitive as we first believed. They represent a different kind of sophistication. How so? The commander asked. He works with the natural properties of materials instead of trying to force them into unnatural shapes, the plant being explained. His shelter succeeded because it was designed to cooperate with the storm, not fight against it. Jake walked over to his shelter and began carefully taking it apart. The alien cadets watched in surprise as he dismantled what had saved their lives just hours before. What are you doing? Dermouth asked. Your shelter is perfect. Why destroy it? Not destroying it, Jake said, setting aside branches and scraping mud from the frame. I am returning it to the forest. These materials do not belong to me. I only borrowed them for a while. This simple act amazed the alien cadets even more than the construction had. In all their advanced civilizations, building something meant claiming it permanently. The idea of temporary use and respectful return was completely foreign to them. You are giving the materials back to nature? Creelon asked, his compound eyes focusing intently on Jake's actions. Everything came from the forest, Jake said. The trees gave me their branches. The earth gave me clay. The plants gave me fibers. Now that I do not need them anymore, I give them back so they can be used again. Commander Vexthari watched this process with great interest. This concept of temporary construction is new to me, Cadet Martinez. Why not leave the shelter standing for future use? Jake paused in his work to consider the question. Because that is not how my people think about building. We take only what we need, and only for as long as we need it. If we took everything and never gave it back, there would be nothing left for the next person. But surely permanent structures are more efficient, Dermouth said. Why rebuild every time instead of building once and using it forever? Because nothing lasts forever anyway, Jake replied. The storm could have destroyed any shelter. The seasons change things, the ground shifts, plants grow. If you try to make something permanent in a world that is always changing, you are fighting a battle you cannot win. Zixara moved closer to watch Jake's careful dismantling. You mean that your construction philosophy accepts impermanence as a fundamental principle? I mean that my people learned to work with the world instead of trying to control it, Jake said. We learned that the best way to survive is to be flexible, to adapt, to change when we need to change. As Jake continued his work, he explained more about human building traditions. He told them about houses that were designed to be moved when families needed to relocate. He described buildings that were meant to last only for a season or a year or just long enough to serve their purpose. But how do you preserve knowledge and achievements if everything is temporary? Creelon asked. We preserve the knowledge, not the buildings, Jake said. I can build another shelter like this one whenever I need it because I know how to read the materials and work with them. The skill is permanent even if the building is not. Commander Vexthari had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. Cadet Martinez, would you be willing to teach these methods to your fellow cadets? Jake looked at his three friends who were all nodding eagerly. I would be happy to share what I know. But they will have to learn to use their hands, not just their machines. We are willing to try, Dermouth said quickly. Last night showed us that our technology is not always enough. Jake smiled and picked up a handful of clay from the stream bank. The first thing to learn is how materials feel. Not what they are made of, but how they want to be used. He passed the clay to Creelon, whose 6 hands immediately began analyzing its texture and consistency. Do not think about it, Jake advised. Just feel it. Is it smooth or rough, sticky or slippery, heavy or light? The insectoid's compound eyes focused on the clay with intense concentration. After a moment, he said, "It feels cooperative, like it wants to be shaped." "Exactly," Jake said. "Now you are beginning to understand." He showed them how to test wood by feeling its grain, how to judge the strength of plant fibers by stretching them gently, how to find the best stones by listening to the sound they made when tapped together. Dermouth discovered that his amphibian skin was actually very sensitive to texture and moisture content. "I never realized I could gather so much information through touch," he said in wonder. Zixara found that her plant-like nature gave her an intuitive understanding of organic materials, once she stopped trying to control them and started listening to them instead. As the day progressed, the alien cadets began to build small practice structures under Jake's guidance. Their first attempts were clumsy and awkward, but they were learning. More importantly, they were beginning to understand a completely different way of thinking about construction and engineering. "This is remarkable," Commander Vexthari said as she watched Creolon successfully weave a small basket from flexible twigs. "You are teaching them to think like humans." "I am teaching them to think like builders," Jake corrected. "Every species that learns to work with their hands develops some of these skills. My people just never stopped using them." The commander's crystalline form seemed to brighten with understanding. "I see, your species maintained these abilities, not because you could not advance beyond them, but because you recognized their continued value." "Yes," Jake said. "We learn that new ways of doing things do not always have to replace old ways. Sometimes the best approach is to use both together." As the exercise concluded, the alien cadets had a new respect for human methods and a new understanding of their own limitations. They had learned that advanced technology could not solve every problem, and that sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best ones. Commander Vexthari made notes in her official report about the importance of preserving diverse approaches to problem solving. The galaxy's most advanced species, she realized, still had much to learn from those they considered primitive. Jake gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave the forest. His fellow cadets walked with him, still asking questions about human building techniques and eager to learn more. "Will you teach us more when we return to the academy?" Zixara asked. "Of course," Jake said. "But remember, the best teacher is the world around you. Learn to listen to what the materials are telling you, and they will teach you more than I ever could." As they walked back toward the academy buildings, Jake looked back once at the forest where his shelter had stood. Already, new plants were beginning to grow through the returned clay and branches. In a few months, there would be no sign that anything had ever been built there. That was exactly how it should be.